I'm going to be talking about generosity. And I'm going to be honest, this is something that I'm approaching, this topic that I'm approaching with some semblance of fear and trembling and humility. Because in my however long years of ministry, I've never given a talk on generosity. And so this is my first time. And so won't you please bear with me as we do. So as we talk about generosity, that means I'm going to be talking about giving. I'm going to be talking about tithe. I'm going to be talking about offering. And I understand that that's a sensitive issue, especially any talk about money in the church, in your families, depending on what kind of family of origin you're coming from, about how you guys view money and how you talk about money. Some families are just like completely open about it. Other families don't even talk about it at all. So I know this is like an issue. This is a topic that requires some wise navigation. And the way I want to do that is, if you guys have any questions or thoughts, I want to make this feel more like a discussion. You can text me. That's literally my number. You can text me at any time throughout this service or throughout me talking up here to ask any questions that you may have about offering, tithes, and generosity. And I'll get it literally right here on the screen, and then I'll try to answer as many of them as I can, as best as I can. And if I can't answer them today, I'll answer them throughout the weeks. And I'm going to have that number throughout. You guys see it right there? Yeah, that's my number, y'all. You can save that forever. Thank you. All right, so this is the passage we're going to be starting with. Deuteronomy 14:23. The Living Bible version says this: "Bring this tithe to eat before the Lord your God at the place he shall choose as his sanctuary. This applies to your tithes of grain, new wine, olive oil, and the firstborn of your flocks and herds." The purpose of tithing is to teach you always to put God first in your lives. And that is the word of the Lord. Amen and amen. So before I get into talking about how transactions, and specifically financial transactions, work in the kingdom, I want to address how financial transactions work in the world. And this is how financial transactions work, just in broad strokes, all right? You give, and then you receive. That's the nature of how specifically modern Western American capitalism and the nature of transaction work in our culture and in our time. We give, and then we will receive. So when you went to Starbucks this morning, you gave Starbucks and their CEO a certain amount of money, probably way more than you were planning to spend. You gave them money, and then what did you receive? A mediocre cup of coffee, right? You do this all the time. You do this with subscriptions. You give Netflix a certain amount of money every single month, and then what do you get? Mediocre shows and television, right? Right? You give Apple, and you give the car companies, you give your loan officers a certain amount of money, and they give you something in return. You give, and only if you give, you will receive. And so that's how the nature of transactions work in our culture and in our time. And don't get me wrong, I'm not demonizing this. I'm not even moralizing this. If anything, this is amoral. This is just how it works. And if anything, this is just how you're only going to be able to get certain results, right? Imagine if you are an employer, imagine you gave a paycheck to your employee before they even did any sort of work. Right? A little bit absurd. You want them to work, and then from the work that they've done, what do? They receive their paycheck, right? So this is not a moralization of how transactions work in our time. This is just the observation. You give, and then you receive. And if anything, sometimes it's necessary to have this sort of the nature, this sort of culture of transactions. But the kingdom is a little bit different. And this is how it works. The nature of transactions in the kingdom is that you receive, and now you have a chance to give. You receive, and now you have a chance, an opportunity to give. Jesus says that you've received eternal life, and from that you give. And so, if anything, the way transactions work in the kingdom is completely upside down. It's backwards. It doesn't fit in with our model of capitalism and a meritocracy. It doesn't fit in with our culture. And in our culture right now, it is necessary to have this sort of transactions, right? Because that's the only way you're going to be able to get results. The mistake that the church and Christianity has done is that we've applied kingdom transactions with worldly transactions. We've treated kingdom transactions the way that we treated worldly transactions. You give, and then you'll receive what? Some peace, good feelings. That's largely how even messages and talks about giving have worked in the church. You give to the church, and then you will receive what? Peace, blessing, and an awesome children's program, which is what we're hoping for this year. You give, and then you receive. But that's the way of the world. It's not bad. It's not great. It's just how it is. The kingdom is that you've received, and you've received the entirety of the kingdom. John 3:16, that God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son. He gave everything. And if you give your son, that's a pretty big deal. That's everything. That's your life. That's your inheritance. That's the one who's going to carry your name. And so the kingdom's nature of transactions is completely upside down. It doesn't fit in with how the nature of transactions work in this world. And to be honest, I've seen the worst of it. I've seen the ugly sides of it. The church planting world, it's really like a church planting business. And whenever, I remember when I was going through church planting training, it felt more like people training me to, be a venture capitalist as opposed to a church planter. So I never got questions about my faith. I never got questions about my prayer life. I never got questions about the kind of risks that I took to follow Jesus. The kind of questions that I got were, what's your pitch? Right? The kind of questions that I got were, all right, in 30 seconds, explain to me why your church is great. And I'm like, I don't know. God just told me to do it, so that's why I'm doing it. It was like this sort of transaction has infected. We can go back. The nature of the world's transactions have infected even how we view transactions in the church. And so when you hear talks about generosity, when you hear talks about giving, you hear talks about people and pastors coming up on the stage talking about how you give, and when you give, it's better to give than it is to receive. And you have more peace in your heart, and the promises of God, and all this stuff, and all the benefits that come with you giving, which are not wrong. It's true. In the Bible, there are 7,000 promises. Did you know that? 7,000 promises. And every promise has a premise. Every promise has a condition. And we may think, oh, God's promises are unconditional. No, God's love is unconditional, but His promises always have a premise. If you, then you will receive this, right? That's the formula for God's promise. And so when you look at God's promise, they all have a premise. And out of the 7,000 promises, the majority of those promises, you know what they're tied to? They're tied to generosity. They're tied to giving. And so when you look at the Bible, just objectively speaking, and look at the 7,000 promises that are ensured to you, that you are given, that you already have received, all those promises are all yours. It's the generosity of the person, of the believer, that unlocks those promises. It's their giving. You received, so now you have the chance to give. But that's not this kind of a talk here today. I'm not here to talk about the benefits of you giving. I'm not here to talk about how if you give, then you'll receive all these promises, because that's the nature of the transactions in this world. What I want to talk about is your receiving and all that you have received. You see, your life that you live right now is an overflow of God's generosity. Everything that you have is an overflow of God's generosity. And I could stand up here and talk about all the 7,000 promises that are ensured to you by your generosity, but I felt like it was more appropriate for me to talk about my own generosity to this church, all right? So let me give you a preface. I'm not here to toot my own horn, to talk about how generous I was to this church and how much I give. I'll explain to that in detail, and if you ask me, I'll even answer some of those questions. But here's what it is. I felt like it would be more powerful and meaningful for us to talk about my own family's generosity to the kingdom of God and just why I personally can't live any other way. So from 2020 till now, my wife and I have been categorically and numerically the largest givers to this church. In 2020, we gave, I won't get into the exact numbers, but in the lump sum of somewhere around middle five figures to start this church. And, to you, that may not seem a lot. And if to you that's not a lot, then you probably have the gift of giving. And I'd love to have a conversation with you and telling you about all that we're believing for, if that's not a lot for you. But to me, as an associate part-time pastor for the majority of my ministerial career, that was a lot. That was everything. And so and you guys know the story, we gave, we took all that, everything that we saved up and threw it at this church to start this church. And, that was like a part of our generosity. And I ran the numbers of all that we received in return from that initial offering. And I didn't see this returned back to my bank account, but I saw it being returned back to this church. And it was somewhere in the range of I think almost tenfold. Almost tenfold. From 2020 till 2022, almost tenfold return of that initial investment, that initial giving that we had in our church. And I never would have thought that. For us, it was just, all right, we're just trying to make it till October 2020. But little did I realize that initial offering from me and my wife was the cornerstone. It was the seed, the foundation of how this whole church got built. And I never would have imagined that we would have got back in return, not necessarily just financially, but everything from equipment, everything from all this different stuff that we received, a tenfold return on our initial offering. So God has already been faithful. From 2020 till 2022, God gave a tenfold return. And I don't know much about money or investments. I know much about generosity, but I don't know about you guys, but a tenfold return in 2 years, like money people, is that like a good return? It feels like it, right? I don't know about you, but it feels like it, right? And so, like I said, okay, I'll give the exact numbers, like 40,000, and return rate was around 400,000, just in terms of everything that received, everything that God did. That's a tenfold return, right? Yes. Math. A tenfold return in 2 years, all right? And so, when we start, and that's not to toot our own horn, and if $40,000 is not a lot to you, I'd love to have a conversation with you and talk about all that we're believing for in this coming year. And you probably have the gift of generosity. But that's what the rate of return was. That's what was the seed of our generosity. And I remember specifically praying one time in late 2022 after we launched this church. I was praying, and then I was like, God, why were you so faithful to us? Why did you give us such a miraculous story? Why did you give us such a blessing? And God said two things. One, he said, remember the offering that you gave. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's right. To me, I didn't even think about it. To me, I didn't look at that lump sum of money and think to myself, oh, look at all that I'm giving. Look at all that I'm giving. It was just almost automatic. It just came out. It didn't happen necessarily joyfully, but it happened automatically. And then two, God said, I trust you. I trust you. So you see here, the way we reconcile this, because if you see just the way the nature of transactions work in the kingdom, we've received the entirety of God's kingdom, and after we receive, we now have the chance to give back. But just because you've received the entirety of God's kingdom and all the 7,000 promises, it doesn't mean that those 7,000 promises are realized or actualized in the life of every Christian. God has a way of working where, to bridge the gap between promise and premise, the way we bridge the gap is trust. Matthew 25, the parable of the talents and of the 3 servants that he gave each a different amount of talent to. God gave talents specifically according to their abilities, And what does Jesus say? He entrusted them with a certain amount. And don't get me wrong, that's a large sum. 1 talent was the equivalent of like $1 million. So whether you got 1, 3, or 5, I'm pretty sure you would take whatever amount of talents that was. And so to the one who was faithful, to the ones who were faithful with those few talents, those many talents, he gave them more. But to the ones who weren't faithful with it, the ones he couldn't entrust with it, he had to take it away. So in God's economy, there is a currency. And the currency of God's economy is not dollar bills. It's not, I don't know what other money in the world, wons, pesos, right? God's economy is not built off of the dollar bill. God's economy is built off of trust. And he says, if I can trust you, you will receive more. And so the way the promises get unlocked is that, yes, you've received everything. You have everything. Everything in the Father's house is yours. But the way we unlock the promises, the way that we explore more of the house, the way that we get more in his kingdom is by giving, is by trust. And that's God's currency. When he can trust you with the little, his economy says that he'll trust you with more. And one of the spiritual formation discipleship exercises that I've had to adopt in my own life is this. I say this to myself all the time. If I'm not blank now, I won't be blank later. If I'm not generous now, I won't be generous later. If I'm not holy now, I won't be holy later. If I'm not righteous now, I won't be righteous later. And it's not a doom and gloom type of statement, but it's a statement that basically says, right now, I have this day in front of me. I have this moment, and I have the opportunity to steward this moment. I'm not going to I can't steward 10 days from now. I can't steward my future. I can't take my future and say, all right, God, I'm gonna entrust that part of my life to you, but for now I'm gonna live it the way that I want to live it. No, I don't have that luxury. No one has that luxury. So if I'm not holy now, I can't expect to be holy later. If I'm not generous now, I can't expect to be generous later. And some of us, we say, oh, you know what? If I had that, if I had this, then of course I would give. Then of course I would want to help out. But, I don't got it right now. No. You see, if you don't do it now, there's a strong chance that you won't be it later. Rick Warren, the guy who wrote Purpose Driven Life. I'm sure you guys all have a copy of it in your house. It was like the book that rivaled the Bible. Like Jesus was shaking in his boots when when he saw the book sales of Rick Warren. And he says this all the time. He said, he was at like some, prayer breakfast luncheon with some national leaders, and one of the leaders went up to him and asked him, Rick, why do you think God allowed you to write Purpose Driven Life? Why do you think God allowed you to write a book that rivaled the Bible? And you know what he said? He said, oh, I know why. It's because God trusts me. He trusted that what I would do with this money would go straight back to him. And his giving, he gives 91% of his income away. That's 91%. I was like running the loose math. His book sales easily in the 9 figures. And so you maybe think to yourself, oh, well, if I had 9 figures, I'd give 91% of my money. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. He gives 91%. I used to think it was 90. That to me was crazy enough. But he had to up the ante and increase his giving. He's like, I don't think I'm giving enough, so I'm going to give 91%. I'm just going to live on single-digit percentage. You see, he didn't get a new car. He didn't move into a new house when he started making all that money with Purpose Driven Life. God trusted him to write Purpose Driven Life, and thus he was allowed to write Purpose Driven Life. I've come to realize that when it comes to even my own personal journey, whatever it is that God is withholding from me, Oftentimes, that's something that God is calling me to be generous with. For example, in the past couple years, when you're starting a church, it's like literally starting a business. And so you're working your butt off. You're trying to do everything that you can to, start this church. And so what that would mean is that I would compromise my time a lot. I would say, you know what? I don't have time to spend 30 minutes with God. I have to go into this meeting. And maybe this meeting will, help fund this church. And maybe this meeting will be the breakthrough that I need. Oftentimes it wasn't. It rarely happened that way. But, God's faithful. He does what he does. But then I slowly, as you are doing that, I slowly started realizing, I felt like, man, I just don't have enough time in the day. And I started realizing that's like mid this year, mid 2023. I was like, why don't I feel like I have enough time? Why don't I feel like I'm like the days just kept on running by, and I'd wake up and then all of a sudden it's nighttime. I'm like, what did I do throughout this day? I felt like I just never had enough time. And then God convicted me about that. He told me, because you're not being generous with your time with me. You're being stingy with your time. So I'm allowing your days to feel stingy. And I realized that. I was like, oh my gosh, God. I didn't prioritize. I didn't do the Deuteronomy 4 principle that if I were to just tithe my time, if I were to put my time with God first. And don't get me wrong, some of you guys, I get it, are not morning people. Like, you're like Shrek when you wake up, right? It's not the best part of your day. I understand. But you see, when it comes to tithing, there was also a generosity that God calls for, not just with my money, but also with my time, with my resources, my energy, my relationships. And if you ever feel like you're lacking in any of those things, resources, time, energy, maybe, just maybe, what God is calling from you is for you to be generous with your time, not just with other people, but with Him. To be generous with Him. To give back to Him what's already His. To give the time, the energy, the relationships, the money, the resources, the access back to Him, and realizing it's all His. It was always His. From the beginning to the end, it was always His. So, when we started this church, like our church, it was like moms and pops, right? I had to do everything. I had to manage the books. I had to do all the accounting. And so, when you basically pour in all the money to the church and, that's basically, your church was like 99.9% your offering. The thought of you like stealing your own money is like ridiculous, right? It doesn't make sense. Like, there's nothing for me to steal. So I didn't need to set up the accountability structures that we have now in place. And I remember catching myself when certain pastors, church planters, aspiring church planters, like would ask me for advice. I'm like, dude, I'm the last person to ask for advice when it comes to church planting. My advice to them is LBO, let's ball out, right? And our team kind of hates hearing that from me, because when it comes to our children and children's ministry, my philosophy financially is LBO, let's ball out for the kids. And thankfully we have like people like Eugenie kind of like reeling that in. And so I'll tell Tabitha, yo, LBO, let's ball out. And Eugenie would be like, okay, let's talk about this first. But that's my philosophy with the children, LBO. And so that's what I would tell people, right? Church planters, I'm like, yo, just ball out, bro. Just just circle a date on your calendar. This was my best advice. Circle a date on your calendar, and after that date, if you don't lose everything, then you're probably not planning a church. You're just starting a ministry. And so, the questions that I would get from other church planters or aspiring church planters, like, they would always ask me like the same set of questions, and it would drive me crazy. They would tell me, Dave, how do you set up accountability for you financially and the systems in place financially so that your church members know that you're trustworthy with the money? And in the beginning, I don't know why, but that question bothered me a little bit. And I would almost respond almost a little bit frustratingly because I would have to tell them, hey, let me, my context is a little bit different. Let me tell you a little bit about our story. All the funding that came from our, that started our church was my money anyways. And so it was mine. And so all the money was mine, and it was mine. And so I didn't need that structure because it was all mine to begin with. And I remember hearing that and frustratingly telling these church planters, and I realized, this is kind of more of a disclaimer, I realized why I was frustrated. Because I was like, oh, it must be nice to start with offering. It must be nice to start a church with people. And it must be nice to have those things in place. I was like, it was literally just us and a prayer. And so we didn't need those accountability structures in the beginning. And so I remember being frustrated about that. And then God stopped me one day. He stopped me because I kept on saying, well, it was all my money to begin with. So, we didn't need to have those structures in place. And then he stopped me. And he asked me a question. And the question that he asked me was, Dave, when did that money become yours? And I was like, I don't know. It was like in my bank account for a little bit. It was under my name for a little bit. I can show you the account numbers, God. I can show you the statements. And he's like, no, Dave, when did that money become yours? And I was like, well, God, no, I get it. Like, when I gave it to the church, it was all yours then. And he was like, no, Dave, when did that money become yours? And sheepishly, humbly, almost embarrassingly so, I had to walk up to God with like a tail between my legs and my head down and be like, God, it was never mine. I was like, it was never mine. And so he was just like, so stop talking about it as if it was yours. I was like, oh gosh, all right. So for the longest time, I wouldn't talk about it. And even when we started this church, I never had to talk about generosity, giving, or even just what we gave to start this church. We never talked about those numbers, and until I felt the release today to do it. But I realized, oh my gosh, when I was talking to all these church planters who when I looked at them, I was like, oh, it must be nice. And, just on a side note, if you ever look at someone's life and you say to yourself, oh, it must be nice. Like, catch that spirit for a second. Because that's not a spirit of love. That's a spirit of lust, right? And when you lust, you want to receive. When you love, you want to give. That's a side note. That's not from me. That's from Rick Warren. And so I realized for the longest time, I kept on telling myself and other people who would ask. I was like, oh, we were the ones who gave. It was my money that started this church. It was my investment that poured into it. So that's why we didn't need to have all these things that you luxuriously get to have, like people and money. And then in God's conviction, in God's humble embrace and gentle rebuke, the question of just, Dave, when did that money become yours? When was it ever yours? I realized, God, it was all yours to begin with. The reason why we tithe is not because we want to guilt trip you into giving to this church so that we could keep the lights on. It's so that, like in Deuteronomy 14, that you will know what it means to put God first. And when you put God first, he takes care of the rest. And even commentators of Deuteronomy 14 have said that, yes, this was a time of agriculture, so the things that you gave were grain and wine and oil. They didn't have dollar bills like we have. What they gave was literally their money. It was their life. It was how they survived. And so when commentators are reading this, they're saying they want us to know that your success, your victory, your life, whenever you give tithe, your success, everything you have, is not dependent on the economy. It's not dependent on the weather. It's not dependent on last year's harvest. but it's dependent on him. Every time you give, it's an act of trust, of you saying, God, this whole world is yours to begin with. Not just the money in my bank account, but it's all yours. The money in Apple's bank account, do you know who that belongs to? Tim Cook? No. Apple? No. It belongs to God. All the resources that are out there, the money that is out there, the money that you get envious of and jealous over, the lottery winners who've won all these lotteries, do you know who that belongs to? God. And so I believe what he's looking for is looking for people, he's scanning the earth for people who are taking all that they've received, all that God has given them, and he's looking for people he trusts. You see, God is a generous God. So what does he do? He sows. He sows seed. He gives seed. And he just keeps on sowing. But God, when he scans the earth again, he's looking for the people who've taken that seed and done something with it. Who've taken that 1 talent, that 3 talents, that 5 talent, and given it back to him. He's looking for people he trusts. And when you're tithing, when you're giving, when you're being generous, what you're doing is it's a declaration of not just your trust in God, but in God's trust of you. So to answer a couple questions here, how do we reconcile? Okay, so the one question that I have here is, why do we give 10% to the church? All right. So here's something that I personally wrestled with for the longest time, because I thought I can just give 10% to anything. I can give 10% totally, in total to charitable organizations, nonprofit work, justice movements, and so on. But why 10%? And this is the passage here, Malachi 3:10. Bring your full tithe to the temple treasury so that there will be ample provisions in my temple. Test me in this and see if I don't open up heaven itself to you and pour out blessings beyond your wildest dreams. I hate the word dreams because it's so American. But when the Bible says dreams, I'm like, all right, let's try it here for a second. There's no other passage that gives a promise like this, that says, I will unleash heaven on you. I will pour out in ways that your wildest dreams can't even think of. I will do all of that. I'll give to you all of it if you could just do your tithe. And so when he's talking about the full tithe to the temple treasury, other passages say storehouses. And it says my temple. It's talking about a 10% to your house of worship. All right. So in our context, it would be Mosaic Covenant Church. Whatever house of worship that you're a part of, that 10% goes to that. So even for my wife and I, to this day, as we are the largest givers to this church, we give 10% of our, anytime a check comes in, anytime there's a deposit, 10% of that automatically goes out. I don't even think about it. It's just automatic. It just happens. Bring your whole tithe to the temple treasury so that the ample provisions in my temple. And I used to think, when I read that, I just think, well, is that just to fund the things of the church? Yes, but also no. That's just part of it. That's not the promise. That's just the natural, that's just the natural result of this passage here. Bring your tithe into your house of worship so that there may be ample provisions, so that there may be a growing children's ministry. But then it says this, the promise is that if you test him in this, basically Malachi is saying, if you just try, you'll see the heavens open up before you in ways that even your wildest dreams can't even imagine. He's just saying, it's just 10%. Not just living on less than what you make, but living on 90% of what you make. God is saying that when you give a tithe, a 10% of whatever comes into your pockets, whatever comes into your account, that when you give that away, it's a test. It's a test of trust to him, saying that he'll pour out all of his blessings beyond your wildest dreams. When people ask me about Mosaic Covenant Church, when people ask me, okay, I'll be honest with you guys. There is no reason why after 3 years of doing this, we should be still here. Can we give Jesus a round of applause for that? Like, I'm being honest with you. I'm not financially savvy enough. I am not strategically smart enough. I'm not like a good enough preacher. I'm not a celebrity pastor. I'm not talking about, I'm not like downgrading myself. I know some of you guys like really don't like it when I like self-deprecate. This is not self-deprecation right now. This is just pure honesty. Like, I know for a fact I don't have what it takes. And my networks who've assessed me have made that very clear too. They've told me, Dave, I don't know, like more of an apostolic bone. I'm like, oh, but my wife's kind of apostolic, right? I'm like, like evangelism. I'm like, oh, but my wife's an evangelist. Don't worry about me. I'm almost irrelevant. There's no reason why we should be still standing here as a church, other than the fact that the one thing I did right was choose to be generous with it from the beginning. And so some of us have come from church backgrounds where you may have heard of church abuse, financial abuse, and so on. But if you really think about that, that's a lot of just bad PR for the church. Why? Because most likely you've heard it through social media or through the internet about, one pastor doing this. If I were to ask you, about what are your experiences with church finance, you'd be like, oh, I heard of a pastor who did this on social media, and so that's why I can't trust a church. There's a good chance if you really get down to like some of the personal level stuff, you probably only know of maybe 1 or 2 actual personal accounts of churches and pastors and church leaders who've abused funds at the church. What you don't hear about is the leaders and the church people who've been generous with the church. Yeah, Rick Warren, we all know that story of 91% of him giving away his money, but that's a celebrity pastor in a mega church. I have a friend in the city who doesn't have a mega church, a couple hundred people in their church. The way that they started their church, he invested $1 million of his own dollars into starting that church. I know of pastors and church leaders in very healthy churches, great churches, who their pastors are the highest givers in their church. Mark Batterson, you guys know him. He probably won't want this to be talked about publicly, so we'll scratch this out of the YouTube. But he is the largest giver to his church. I know churches in this local area where their pastors, they're not celebrity pastors, they're not mega churches, and their church leaders are the most generous. They're the highest givers in that church. I'm not saying this to toot our own horn, but let me tell you, for every bad story you hear about church leaders taking advantage of funds, there are probably twice as many church leaders out there who are doing the right thing, who are being incredibly generous. And I say this with all humility and fear and trembling, that as my wife and I have been the largest givers to this church, I'm not saying that to toot our own horn. I'm saying that because God has sustained this church when there was zero giving and when there was zero people. There's literally no reason why we should still be around. That's not, I don't know if you know anything about church, but that's not the formula to start a church with zero people and zero giving, right? But that's what God did. That's how God started this church. And when I talk about generosity and when I talk about giving, I know what that feels like, because to us, that 40 grand to me was everything. To you, if it's not a lot, I'd love to have a conversation with you and tell you a little bit about what we're believing for, right? To us, it was everything. But it wasn't even a sacrifice. It wasn't even a question. It was scary. But it wasn't even a sacrifice. It was just something that just automatically, we just knew, okay, we prayed about it. We just knew, okay, this is what we're going to do. And this is how we're going to live. And I guarantee you, from that moment, from March 2020 till now, I can assure you I can't live any other way. I can't live. Yeah, Tito. Yeah, you can clap for me, man. I can assure you I can't live any other way. Yeah, sometimes it's like a little bit envious when I hear about 401ks and stable salaries and all that stuff. Sometimes that's kind of envious, just that life. But then when I examine just what God has done, when I examine the tenfold blessing that he did in 2 years, when I see what he's done with what I give, which was already all his to begin with, I look at God and I'm like, man, God, I can't live any other way. And so this talk here is not to coerce you or to convince you to give 10%. That's between you and God. And if you haven't prayed about it, don't do it out of compulsion today. Go home, pray about it, think about it, consider it, because that's actually technically not generosity. That's just the biblical requirement. Generosity is when you go above. My wife and I, we give more than 10% of our money away. Not just to organizations that are doing good work, but even just to people. We give more than 10% of our income away before taxes, which is terrifying. But for a fact, I know for myself, I can't live any other way. Why? Because I've known what it feels like to be loved by God. But now I know what it feels like for God to open up the heavens. I now know what it feels like for God to be wildly and radically generous with me. And so some of you have felt and experienced God's love. But it's possible that you haven't experienced the overabundance of God's generosity. And there's a chance that you've just been withholding from him, that you've been robbing him. So I'll go back to the illustration of time. So I told God, you know what, God? I'm convicted. I don't feel like I have enough hours in the day. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to dedicate an hour of my day to you every single day. And sometimes that's hard, and sometimes I go over. But I told God, I said, God, I'm so serious about this that I'm going to write in my journal when I start and when I end. And if I rob you of even a minute, God, I promise you I'll make that up at the end. And I've been doing that faithfully. And you know what? I just feel like, I'm like, man, there's just so much time in the day. I don't know what it is. I just felt like, man, I've just been enjoying, when I'm not getting an anxiety attack or something. I've just been I'm like, man, God, I just enjoy this moment and this time. I'm like, God, this day is amazing. You see, when we're generous with God, he becomes generous with us. When we're stingy with God, he becomes stingy with us. And it's not to punish us, but because he cares so much about him pouring out his blessings on you, he's telling you and himself, I need to trust you with this first in order for me to pour out. I need to trust you that you'll handle my blessings with care, with consideration, with the benefit of others, and that this is going to a generous spirit. I've known what it's like to live the generous life, and I assure you, I can't live any other way. God has been so faithful. He's been so good. And his beauty is not just in his mystical love for me, but his beauty is in his generosity to me, which is love in action. And every single moment, even when it gets scary, I tell God, God, you've poured out so much. I have stories for days, y'all. Stories for days of God's generosity. And y'all, and praise team, you guys can come up. I can promise you I'm going to end with this. And some of you guys are probably just thinking about, oh, okay, well, it's because it's needs. God just cares about my needs. You know what God says in the Bible? You know what the Bible says about your needs? He says, stop praying for them. Because he already knows what you need. So 99% of your prayer life, God probably doesn't hear because you're only praying about the things that he's already done for you and taken care of for you. He wants to take you to the wildest dreams. And so I'll end with this, all right? Praise him. I promise you I'll end with this. In 2020, it was the worst year of my life, the hardest year of my life. And yesterday, it was my birthday. You don't have to clap for that. I received that. In 2020, I remember waking up, and I was really depressed. I was in a dark spot. You know, that was the year we decided to start this church. But everything was scary. I had nobody and nothing. And I remember praying as I was walking the dog, just painfully and in tears. I remember praying, I said, God, I don't know how, but can you give me a gift? Can you give me a gift that money can't buy? Because God, you know I don't got it. But can you give me a gift that money can't buy? I don't know what, I don't know how, but Lord, can you just let me know that you're there? As I finished that walk, I came into the house and I got a text message. And it was a picture. It was a picture of my dog, Lady, a German Shepherd with mysterious husky features. And it was a dog, and it was from our friend in Mexico, and she texted us the picture of that dog and said, the dog was born today, and this one's yours. And just to give you some background, when we moved into our house and God gave us that miraculous home, that house was like way too big for us to for me to comfortably live in. So I was telling my wife, I was like, I don't know, maybe I should get cameras, I was even considering getting a bow and arrow because I was like watching, it was COVID, y'all. You just get into weird hobbies. I was like, should I get a bow and arrow? And my wife she was kind of trolling me. She was like, what are you going to do, just record the crime? And I'm like, I don't know, it's something. And she's like, what are you going to do with the bow and arrow? Are you going to get it out and protect this family with it? I was like, I guess not, huh? And our friend, he said, the best thing you could do is actually just have a big dog. And so off the cuff, when we moved into the house, I just said, you know what? When we're ready, when we're financially able, I want a German Shepherd. I want a German Shepherd that will protect this realm and my children. I thought it was going to be years down the road. I thought getting a dog like that would be something that would be in my wildest dreams. It was literally a pipe dream for me. I never would have imagined it. And then all of a sudden, our missionary friend, we invite him to our house. And then he's telling us that he has German Shepherds on his compound that are about to give birth. And then he asks me, this was in October of 2020, do you guys want one? And we're like, yeah. And at that time, the dogs weren't even born yet. And knowing this missionary, he's probably forgot what he was promising. So we're just like, it may not happen. And then as I was walking the dog and I finished the walk, as I was asking God, can you just give me a gift that I can't pay for, that money can't buy? And then I'm getting that picture of Lady, our dog, our miracle dog. I realized, oh my gosh, this German Shepherd was just a wild dream. It was to replace a camera and a bow and arrow. And God would even care about something like that. I realized, oh man, I didn't need this dog. And if anything, I couldn't afford this dog. But because God cared so much, but because God loved us so much, that he was willing to give his one and only Lady. Actually, no, that dog was born through a whole litter of dogs. But that dog was mine. It's the perfect dog for us. You see, God cares about your dreams in ways that you can't even imagine. God cares about your wants more than you could ever dream of. You're praying about needs. No, he's 10 steps ahead of you. He's praying about your wants, your dreams, and your desires. And he says, all you need to do is just take 1/10 of everything you're bringing in, because it's all mine to begin with. Give me the 1/10, and I'll take care of the rest. It's a practice to make sure that you know that God is first and that God is all. It's a daily, weekly practice in your life for you to remember that God is the one who takes care of you, not you. And you guys have gone through some stuff. I know it. You guys have gone through some stuff where all you've known in your life is you taking care of yourself. And I know people in my life who are incredibly wealthy, who are almost bitter at God, saying, no one's going to take care of me, so I have to take care of my own. Let me tell you something. All that changes here today. It stops today. Because you're going to know that God is the one who provides. You will know that God is the one who cares. You will know that God is the one that not just takes care of your needs, but he takes care of your wants and dreams and desires. That's our God. And I want you to experience that with me. Mosaic wasn't something that I needed. It was a dream. It was a dream. I didn't need this. You don't need this. But God was just like, I like this. Let's run with it. Can we all rise?